It's just so austere. It's the Heritage Foundation. Now, clearly not everybody who voted for John Kerry, not everyone, like I say my cousin, but I'll be honest with you, it's my sister, who will mindlessly accept, without question, without doubt, that of course we went to Iraq to steal their oil, because that's what America does. No need to even consider any other possibility. That's how sure she is that America is imperialist and we steal resources and whatnot. Not everyone who voted for John Kerry and who fits that description is aware of the elite's blueprint for utopia. That's what I call it. But what the elite have succeeded in doing, by the way, I don't think they would support it if they were. I don't think my cousin would trade off supporting evil, failure, and wrong for some promise of a future utopia. But what the elite have succeeded in doing through the institutions we've allowed them to control, and if we're going to save America, we must take back the schools, the universities, the media, the entertainment industry. What the elite have succeeded in doing is indoctrinating, starting with the very young and going all the way up through college and beyond, starting the first time they turn on Sesame Street and Buster Bunny, going up through the middle years when they're told, hey, little boy, if you have a queer eye, you're going to be a cool guy. But hey, little girl, doesn't matter how cool you are. If you grow up to be a heterosexual married woman, you're going to be a desperate housewife. And going all the way up, and all the other shows that are on the air, I can't say all, but so many of the other shows that are on the air that show family and marriage and all the things that are traditional that we recognize as good, there's the war at home. There's terms of engagement. There's another, it's not terms, it's rules of engagement, as if it's another battle. They wouldn't make room for daddy in shows like those because they were not realistic. So instead we now have the Bundys, where the mother and the father hate each other and looking to get as much as they can from each other, and just this whole mindset. And it continues on through Ward Churchill's ethnic studies class. And what happens is they're indoctrinated into what I call a cult of indiscriminateness. And the way the elite does this is by teaching our children, starting with the very young, that rational and moral thought is an act of bigotry. That no matter how sincerely you may seek to gather the facts, no matter how earnestly you may look at the evidence, no matter how disciplined you may try to be in your reasoning, your conclusion is going to be so tainted by your personal bigotries, by your upbringing, by your religion, by the color of your skin, by the nation of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's birth, that no matter what your conclusion, it is useless. It is nothing other than a reflection of your bigotries. And therefore, the only way to eliminate bigotry is to eliminate rational thought. You know, there's a brilliant book out there, and those of you who know it will recognize how heavily informed my opinion is by it. It's called The Closing of the American Mind by Professor Alan Bloom. And Professor Bloom was trying to figure out, I'm going to be blunt, he was a little less blunt, he was trying to figure out in the 80s why his students were suddenly so stupid. And what he came to was the realization, the recognition, that they'd been raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative, because its opposite is the evil of having discriminated. But I paraphrase this in my own works. I say, in order to eliminate discrimination, the modern liberal has opted to become utterly indiscriminate. I'll give you an example. At the airports, in order to not discriminate, we have to intentionally make ourselves stupid. We have to intentionally pretend we don't know some of the things we do know. And we have to pretend that the next person who's likely to blow up an airplane is as much the 87-year-old Swedish great-great-grandmother as those 4 27-year-old imams newly arrived from Syria screaming Allah Akbar just before they board the plane. In order to eliminate discrimination, the modern liberal has opted to become utterly indiscriminate. The problem is, of course, that the ability to discriminate, to thoughtfully choose the better of the available options, as in she's a discriminating shopper, is the essence of rational thought. So quite literally, we are dealing with the whole of Western Europe and today's Democratic Party, dominated as it is by this philosophy, that rejects rational thought as a hate crime. So what you're left with after 10, 12, 14, 20 years in the leftist indoctrination centers that our schools have become are citizens of voting age who, on the one hand, are utterly unwilling and incapable of critically judging the merits of the positions they hold, and have held unquestioned since they're 5 years old, since they first entered the leftist indoctrination process. All right, this is important to me because that sounds impossible. I mean, are you saying that they have the mentality of 5-year-olds? That sounds like hyperbole, and I've tried to avoid hyperbole. It sounds perhaps, as a gratuitous slander. There was a book that came out at just about the same time as Professor Bloom's that in some ways even better describes and explains the mindset of the modern liberal. It was called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And it reads like the Bible of modern liberalism and the playbook of Democratic Party policy. Yes, of course, you'll notice in the title, he doesn't say, Robert Fulghum doesn't say, all I know I learned in kindergarten. Of course, Bill Maher has learned a good number of things, including bigger words. But the concepts that he still holds dear, that he learned in kindergarten. So yeah, the sentence fragment, don't hit, which is one of the lessons that Fulghum refers to, has morphed into an entire sentence now that they're adults. It's war is not the answer. And of course, they've learned things in between, but they didn't really need to know anything. Because even though they know about, I'm going to say Ward Churchill, Neville Chamberlain, even though they know about Neville Chamberlain, they know about what happens if you appease evil, they don't really need to know it, because knowing it or not knowing it would not have changed the position they have now and have held unquestioned since they're 5. When I was 5 years old, I used to go around the neighborhood trick-or-treating with my friends on Halloween, not every day. And and we'd have in one hand a bag for candy, and the other hand a little box with a slit on top for nickels and dimes and pennies for UNICEF, for the United Nations. Right? Because at 5 years old, the United Nations is a terrific thing. Don't hit, talk. Another lesson for Robert Fulghum is share everything. Well, yeah, we'll share power, we'll share our wealth, we'll pay for the United Nations, let's talk things out. What a lovely, wonderful thing. Then you turn 10, 15, 20, and you learn some things about the United Nations that change your opinion. You learn about the corruption. You learn about the anti-Semitism. You learn about they ran away from the genocide in Rwanda, have done nothing about the Sudanese genocide. In fact, made the Sudanese members of the Human Rights Commission while they were committing this genocide. And you and I change our position because these are things we really need to know. Yet they will maintain their 5-year-old's position, their belief that the United Nations is this great, wonderful thing, and completely ignore everything they've learned since. And quite literally are locked into. There was a song that came out at about this time. It was called Goodbye Stranger by a group called Supertramp, because being a tramp is super. And in it, this guy and this girl hook up, and they shack up together for a couple of weeks, and apparently things are pretty wonderful until she says something like, honey, we've run out of food, why don't you go to the supermarket and we can do this for another week or two. He says, I should go shopping? No, that's not my paradise. No, I'm leaving. And as he's walking out the door, he says to her, now, I believe that what you say is the undisputed truth, but I have to see things my own way just to keep me in my youth. And that is so much the mindset of the modern liberals. It's not that they're not aware of all the things that we're aware of. It's that they need to reject them in order to remain in this 5-year-old utopia that they've been told is the only hope for mankind. A mindless indiscriminateness. So what you're left with is not only adults, citizens of voting age who cannot judge their own positions, but who are virulently antagonistic to any position other than their own. Why? Because when you've been brought to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative, any position other than their own must have employed discrimination. This is why Bush is Hitler. This is why Reagan is Hitler. This is why Giuliani is Hitler. How's Rudolph Giuliani like Hitler to a thinking person? Well, in one way. Hitler discriminated against the Jews. Rudolph Giuliani discriminated against the crack-addicted prostitutes in Times Square. Hitler discriminated against the Catholics. Giuliani discriminated against the criminal overlords. Right? Hitler discriminated against the gypsies. Giuliani discriminated against the terrorists on 9/11 and beyond. See, any form of discrimination is discrimination. They know that theirs is the position arrived at through the moral imperative of indiscriminateness. Therefore, any position other than their own must have been arrived at through the employment of discrimination. So this makes you not just wrong on your issues and your stances. They don't even think about your issues and your stances. They don't have to. Even if they were willing to, even if they were able to, they don't need to. Would you sit and contemplate Hitler's Social Security policy? No, you would fight Hitler. So what you're left with is, after 10, 12, 14, 20 years in these indoctrination centers, and it's not a coincidence, the longer you stay in the indoctrination process, the more morally inverted you become. And so, to be head of the ethnic studies department, you have to argue that the Islamic fascist terrorists are the good guys, and the victims of 9/11 were all little Eichmanns. Right? So what you're left with is people who quite literally cannot differentiate between good and evil, right and wrong, better and worse. But here's the key. Indiscriminateness of thought does not lead to indiscriminateness of policy. Indiscriminateness of thought invariably leads the modern liberal, inevitably leads them to side with evil over good, wrong over right, and the behaviors that lead to failure over those that lead to success. Why? Because in a world where you are indiscriminate, where no behavior is to be deemed better or worse than any other, then your expectation is that all behavior should lead to equally good outcomes. When in the real world, different behaviors lead to different outcomes. You and I know why. Because we think. We know why teenage promiscuity in communities that promote promiscuity tend to fail at a greater rate than communities that promote teenage abstinence. Because teenage promiscuity and teenage abstinence are not the same behaviors. Teenage abstinence is a better behavior. Now, forget the moral component for a moment. Let's just talk practicalities. If your boy's out messing around, he's not home reading a book. If your daughter's down at the abortion mill again, she's not at the library studying for the SATs. If your son's in a hospital bed somewhere dying of AIDS, he's not putting together his 5-year plan. So you and I recognize why those communities that promote teenage abstinence do better than those that promote teenage promiscuity in their music, in their movies, even in the schools. But to the modern liberal who cannot make that judgment, must not make that judgment, that would be discriminating. They have no explanation. So therefore, the only explanation for success has to be that somehow success has cheated. Success, simply by its existence, is proof positive to the modern liberal of some kind of chicanery and likely bigotry. Failure, simply by its existence, no other evidence needed, just the fact that it has failed is enough proof to them that failure has been victimized. So the mindless foot soldier, which is what I call the non-elite, will support the elite's blueprint for utopia, will side with evil over good, wrong over right, and the behaviors that lead to failure over those that lead to success, and have a sense of justice. This is why I said at the beginning, they're not evil. My cousin is not evil. But it's just a mindless acceptance that in a world where she's indiscriminate, where her answer to any political question is, so what? Without any true Socratic desire to have that so what lead to, yeah, let's talk about the real consequences. So what, just being an indiscriminate rejection of any possibility about the future. It's meaningless to them. And it's why John Lennon said utopia was all the people living for today. And by the way, it is not a coincidence that those who live for today now have so much debt. What is debt? It's the failure to repay a promise from yesterday. And vote themselves nothing but more and more entitlements, which is what? Stuff for me, I'll worry about who pays for it later. The same is true of good and evil. Since nothing can be deemed good, nothing can be deemed evil, that which society does recognize as good must be the beneficiary of some sort of prejudice. That which society recognizes as evil must be the victim of that prejudice. So again, the mindless foot soldier will invariably side with whatever policy, mindlessly accept whatever policy seems to tear down what is good, America, Israel, Walmart, elevate what is evil, until everything meets in the middle and there's nothing left to fight about. Folks, let's take an issue in the news, and let's think like a modern liberal. And you will see how once you subscribe, once you've been indoctrinated into this mindset, there is no other choice. Remember I said it was inevitable. Once you belong to this cult of indiscriminateness, there is no other conclusion you can come to than that good is evil, and that evil is the victim of good. We all know it's standard practice, in fact it's official policy at the leftist media outlets, to never call Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Aqsa's Martyrs Brigade, or any of the other Islamic fascist terror groups around the world terrorists. And you know why, you've heard it a million times. In fact, it's even in one of the official memos from, I forget the news organization, probably the Times, to the reporters ordering them not to use the appropriate word. And that reason is, hey, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Who are we to employ critical, rational judgment? But if one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, see, you and I can tell the difference. We, at least as a very minimum standard, can't we at least agree that in order to be called a freedom fighter, you have to be fighting for freedom? Right? We know what Osama bin Laden is fighting for. He's told us. It's not freedom. It's an oppressive theocracy in which women are covered from head to toe. And unless we all change to his religion, we are considered the offspring of pigs and monkeys. You know, you'd think at least we'd have PETA on our side. I figured it was time for a joke. Just in case some of you have been fooled going, he's not that funny. We expected something very different. But quite literally, being indiscriminate leaves people like Cindy Sheehan and Michael Moore, they will call Osama bin Laden a freedom fighter. Because quite literally, being indiscriminate leaves them unable to tell the difference between freedom and having your head hacked off. That is quite literally how sick this mentality is. All right, so if there is no objective difference between the terrorist and the freedom fighter, then why is it that you and I in our schools teach that George Washington is a hero and Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein are villains? See, you and I know why, because we think George Washington risked his personal fortune to personally lead his troops into battle. Battles fought nobly against other uniformed warriors for the purpose of creating the freest nation in the history of the world. Pretty noble, pretty heroic stuff. Yasser Arafat, on the other hand, stole his people's money, sent 14-year-olds out to fight his battle. Battles fought against kids and women and civilians at pizza parlors and at Passover ceremonies and whatnot, all for the purpose of maintaining his corrupt dictatorship. Pretty villainous stuff. But to the folks at the New York Times who have established as official policy that there is no objective difference between the terrorist and the freedom fighter, why do we teach our children that George Washington is a hero? The only possible explanation is because he's a white Christian of European descent. If there is no difference between the behaviors of the terrorists, then why do we teach that Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein are villains? There can be no other reason than that darker-skinned Muslims of Middle Eastern birth. So when push comes to shove, and after 18 United Nations resolutions and 10 years of having our airplanes shot at in direct violation of our very clear agreements, after Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran and invaded Kuwait, bombed Saudi Arabia and bombed Israel, committed atrocities against the Kurds in the north and committing genocide against the Marsh Arabs in the south, we finally and reluctantly go to war to liberate those poor people. You and I know why, because we think, because we make critical, rational, moral judgments. But to the modern liberal, to the mindless, to those who cannot discriminate between these behaviors, the only possible explanation for us going to war is some nefarious cause because we're evil and Saddam Hussein, therefore, is a victim. And they will rush there, as we've seen, and act as human shields to protect his rape rooms and his torture chambers, because they won't judge rape rooms and torture chambers. That requires judgment. And if you listened to the chants of the mindless minions, they march down the street in their anti-America rallies, which the forged document users in the leftist press euphemistically called anti-war rallies, you could hear their chant, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your racist war. What race exactly comprises Iraq? What are they talking about? They don't know. There's not a clue. It's not a factual statement. It's not an accurate statement. Wait a second. Didn't we just recently go to war to protect Muslims in Kuwait? Didn't we bomb the Christians of Europe to protect the Muslims of Europe? I mean, what is this based on? It's based on the reality that once you subscribe to indiscriminateness, anything other than indiscriminateness is the evil of having discriminated. All right, well, I'm open for questions if